As with a number of others, this is a much longer paper that was at a major conference last year and is being published in the Biblical and Ancient Greek Linguistics Journal coming up later this year, but this is a slight adaptation of that. And I'll divide the terms as we go along and explain why the linkage, and I hope that by giving you just some pieces along the way, I can still create a cohesive sense of what's going on and what I was looking at. I'm going to read the abstract first. Contact linguistics explores the effects of sustained interaction between dissimilar language communities upon the morphophonemic, lexical, and syntactic features of each community's code or codes. This paper demonstrates through modern and some ancient language situations that language orality rather than transcription is the primary mechanism for contact-induced language change. Contact linguistics is a subfield of sociolinguistics, which explores the influence of independent social environmental factors upon dependent language choices and usage. Contact linguistics specifically studies how structural and semantic features of language can be exchanged mutually when language communities have sustained interaction. A influences B and B influences A. It goes both ways, whether or not they possess equal status. And there's implications. I'm going to leave out that there's scores of people that are quoted and scholars that are being leaned on. And it's also a zone I've been publishing in intermittently for a number of decades. So I'm going to leave that out so I can just get a sense of a flow. So in other words, this is not the field for most of you, and I'd like you to be able to see how it works and what it's about. So certain perennial inevitabilities of human societies include death, taxes, and language contact. The first we owe to the broken nature of the creation. The second to the exigencies of bureaucracy, while the third is creditable to God's penchant for mass diversification. Given that there are some 400,000 species of beetles that populate our planet, and more than 7,500 types of apples are grown around the globe, the fact that there are more than 7,100 different living languages today, not to mention dialects, and not to mention dead languages from the past, it should come as no surprise. It seems par for the divine course and points to the inevitability that codes, language codes, will collide with considerable frequency. So it's natural to ask, what are the effects of repeated collisions or sustained language contact upon various situations, and specifically, what's to be expected when it comes to a New Testament that is born out of contact-rich circumstances? So that's what this is about. My ultimate interest is specifically getting into the Greek of the New Testament. I've done some work on the Hebrew of the Old, but my area is primarily the Greek of the New Testament. Broadly speaking, and quoting someone who was very influential on my studies, formerly at the University of Pittsburgh, myself as well as her, Sally Thomason observes that, quote, language contact is the use of more than one language in the same place at the same time. That's a very generic definition, but that's one that'll work for us perfectly well. I'm going to leave out a lot of the nitty-gritty background stuff and push a little further. Contact linguistics, like sociolinguistics in general, concerns itself with how social circumstances influence language choices per what's called the Lazarsfeld formula, which is you're getting at who speaks what language to whom, when, how, and why. And there's various formulations of that, but that's pretty much how that Lazarsfeld formula works. And then this positions want to consider the possible avenues of influence and also related outcomes emanating from the contact. So contact linguistics straddles traditions within the field of sociolinguistics, though it's it's on how social interactions involve different speakers of different languages and a variety of things that go with it. I'm going to just keep on moving. So to get sort of where I directed my study while cutting out as much as I can of the background scholarly platform on which I'm basing what I do, we can begin by saying there are different kinds of change that get effected by regular language contact, and then turn our attention to where this may shape biblical studies. So we want to see what's out there in languages today, living languages today, with the understanding that if humans are humans to some degree, the kinds of things you see today presumably were in operation in other societies, other times, maybe thousands of years ago. Some of the things that go on are what's called borrowing. In fact, Thomason even develops a borrowing scale. Borrowing is where you have conditions such that basically vocabulary that was not with one group gets basically taken. We call it borrowing, but you don't give the words back. You keep them once you take them. Okay? That's one thing. So foreign words that then eventually become just sort of integrated and regularized in your own system. We do tons of this in English. I've got tons of examples in English, but I want to make this fit into 20 minutes. There's a mechanism called code switching and a similar one called code alteration, where a person is having some kind of a speech act or a written act. It happens both ways. And they're plugging along in one language, and then suddenly with a word, a phrase, maybe even a whole sentence, maybe multiple sentences, switch to the other language and then come back to the original language of production. By the way, my first foray into this was about 40 years ago, interviewing the Amish in the communities of Smicksburg and Dayton, Pennsylvania. The same town names show up in Ohio, but these were Pennsylvania, and looking at their language production and some fascinating stuff. I really don't get to talk about that here, but that was some of my early work there. True contact-induced borrowing takes many different directions. Sometimes certain words get maintained in both languages, all right? And sometimes when you borrow, you nevertheless keep what you had, but you then add new vocabulary, and these things get kept side by side. We do a lot of this in English. So for example, just take, there's countless examples. We work with Germanic and French words back to back all the time when we talk about cows, sheep, swine versus beef, mutton, pork, okay? You've got different sources of these languages. And the best opportunity of all, if you're a criminal in America, you get the opportunity to being convicted bilingually, okay? When you're convicted, let's say, of aiding and abetting, all right? So you've got a Latinate base as well as Germanic, or breaking and entering, a Germanic and a Latin. What a great country America is. Also, you get the word loss. So sometimes a word gets borrowed from the other code, and that has the result of knocking out, usually slowly, knocking out a word that was in your own code, but for some reason people prefer the borrowed word. And a real simple example here, if you go back to the origins of English with Anglo-Saxon, you had at least 3 different words for males, adult males. So there was man, or man, and there was thane, and there was wera, okay? Now, thane, unless you've been reading Shakespeare or sometimes some other poetic stuff, almost nobody has even heard of thane, and nobody uses it. If you do use it, your friends think you are weird. They just didn't want to tell you yet. Man, or man, we keep. That's the customary one, albeit we pronounce it in our own way. And wera shows up, to best of my knowledge, only in one construction. And some of you know what that is. If you are a man-wolf, you are a werewolf. Okay, but other than that, I think it's gone. So you get words that get either paralleled and kept, but other things get pushed out. Now, ultimately, what I'm asking is, so what does this have to do with biblical studies? And ultimately, that's what we're looking at here. I like to come back to an interesting comment made roughly a century ago by an encyclopedic student, or I should say professor and student of the Greek of the New Testament, A.T. Robertson, in his monumental grammar, came out 1934-35, I feel like it was just yesterday, at which he comments with respect to some of the non-standard Greek that shows up in John's Gospel. And he's talking specifically about a phrase that usually gets translated into English something like Jesus was full of grace. Okay, the particular Greek, the pleres charitos construction, is a little bit odd for the Greek. Okay, and here's Robertson's comment on that phrase, especially when many then and later would say, well, this is bad Greek, or they'd use various value judgments on it. And Robertson says the papyri have taught us to be chary about charging John with being ungrammatical in the use of his phrase. And Robertson says these matters simply show that New Testament writers used a live language, and they were not automata, nor were they AI. And so in an environment where multiple languages, and I think you're generally aware there's multiple things going on with multiple levels of Hebrew, as, by the way, Scott Scheidemantel was telling us last night in his paper, multiple levels of Greek, some use of Latin, probably multiple levels of Aramaic as well, and different people have these in different combinations, and we have some idea of what's going on, but we really don't know it with precision. Anyway, that's that. So these language relationships and the interconnection of them and the interuses of them make for some interesting things. So what do we have in the New Testament? Let's get down to specifically the Greek of the New Testament. We absolutely have code switching, and don't worry if you don't know Greek, you will still be able to relate to this based on your knowledge of your English and the way typically the English is working in representing these things. So we have on the one hand a statement of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? By the way, this one I do need to comment on. It's an interesting mixture, it seems, of Hebrew and at least one Aramaic word. Okay? Now it's being represented in Greek, which makes it a bit challenging. But we'll say tentatively Hebrew and some Aramaic in some of Jesus' final words. Not surprising, they're both wrong. Now here's some of the ones you do know. Okay? Go to 1 Corinthians 16:22, and you have reference to if someone is being bad, anathema maranatha. Some of the English Bibles keep that entire phrase. It's in Greek letters, but it's representing this phrase, a Semitic phrase, accursed be the unbeliever, may the Lord come. Okay? It's actually a bit of a play, I actually call it a play on words. It's catchy. You have Jesus saying to a man who's deaf as he's healing him, and you got to hear the New Testament's in Greek, the Gospels are in Greek, but it's representing Semitic, perhaps Hebrew, perhaps Aramaic. Jesus says to the man, I want you to look at my mouth as I say what Jesus said. Ephatha. Now watch what's visible. Ephatha. So if you have someone who's deaf, they can't hear you, obviously, but they can look, and if they have some knowledge of the words, they can probably guess pretty closely what you're saying to them. So you've got this kind of code switching. Somebody being called a raka, or a fool. That's Aramaic, that's in Matthew chapter 5, and things like that. So code switching, and by the way, there's many, many more studies of this. I wrote a book on it that was out many, many years, my first monograph, and I talk about these things at length. So I think I'll move on from the code switching. Sometimes enough code switching happens, and the words that are switched to almost become regular in the language that has sort of become habitual in borrowing them, and you come over to loan words. So you have, for example, words like amen, amen. You all know the word, okay? It's Semitic, borrowed into Greek, borrowed into English, and we treat it as if it's an English word, amen, amen. But it's been multiple levels of borrowing that's going on. This is loan words. We have words like korban, dedicated to God. Many English Bibles keep the Semitic word korban. mammon, Abba, father, Raka, fool, and so forth. And the favorite that all of us know, Rabbi, or rabbi. Again, it's a Semitic loan word into the Greek, but also coming into the English, as is Hosanna. Okay, may the Lord save, and others examples. Okay, we have what's called name translations in the New Testament, where you have a name that's given, and then there's like an explanation of what it means, where presumably the people in the original environment would have known this, but then realizing that the reader of an account may come from a completely different environment, you explain. For example, in Revelation 9:11, reference to Abaddon, which is in the Greek Apollyon. That's what the text says, giving us a translation. One of my favorites, and I think you all know the word Armageddon, based on Revelation chapter 16, is from Har Megiddo, the Mount of Megiddo. All right? But it gets borrowed and then slightly morphed a little bit further, and becomes kind of a standard. Jesus is being tried at the Lithostraton Hebraiste de Gabbatha, the place called the Lithostratos, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Again, this explanation of a name, so you're given multiple meanings of it in different languages. Again, these name translations are showing up. Calques, that's a new word to many people. It's spelled C-A-L-Q-U-E, and a calque is where you have a phrase, sometimes a word, but usually a phrase, where it's familiar to the borrowing language, but it's keeping the meaning more typical of the other language, okay? So when you get a word like nephesh, which technically means soul, but often in the Hebrew, brought into the Greek, but you get Hebrew, it often just means I or me, like the totality of me is the nephesh, okay? So when you see psuche translating that, it's suke in that more Semitic, holistic sense. So you get calques like that. One of my favorite calques is in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, when Jesus is being named. If you look at the original, and some English translations actually keep it, they say, they called his name Jesus. Now that is understandable in Greek as it is in English. We would say they named him Jesus, or they gave him the name Jesus. Greek would have a couple possible constructions as equivalent, but it keeps the phrasing of the Hebrew, they called his name. And that's what you call a calque. And there's many others, like sarx kai haima, flesh and blood. It's a very familiar phrase now in English, but again, it's a calque. And then an interesting one to me, and I'm going to just, I've published 2 different articles on this, is language labels are interesting because in various places in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts, there's a reference to Paul speaking Hebrew. The problem is most of us think Hebrew has a very limited use. It's not gone out, but it's extremely narrowed and limited use. And Aramaic, its sister language, is the parlance of the day. So why is it we keep reading in various accounts in the book of Acts, including where Paul is arrested after his return from the third missionary journey, that he speaks to the group in Hebrew? And what at least some of us are thinking is, yeah, there's Hebrew in there, but it's mixed with Aramaic. It may have some Greek. Sometimes names get labeled, not so much because it's a description of the language, but it's more attuned to the political situation. So I'm sitting on a plane. This is a well-known example, and it's incontrovertible. I'm sitting traveling somewhere, and the fellow next to me is from Belgium. And I said, oh, do you speak French, Belgian French, or the other language? He goes, no. He says, I speak Flemish. And I said, exactly. I said, and we both know what Flemish really is, don't we? And he gets a red face. Yeah, it's Dutch, But in Belgium, our dialect, we call it Flemish, And that's a political statement. It's largely Dutch. I'm waiting for the day, by the way, we say we speak English, and nothing wrong with the label, but I'm waiting for the day when the dialects are so long apart, British English versus American English, we just start to say I speak American, because that's not an inappropriate kind of a statement to make. I think I've cultivated my American pretty well and suppressed my, my British Australian successfully. Anyway, that's what I'm getting into here, and I'm basically saying when these kinds of changes take place, contrary to multiple generations of scholarship, and I am going largely backward of that reference, who said these kinds of constructions suggest or prove that the New Testament was not originally in Greek. The claim is that it was probably in Aramaic, or Matthew may have been in Hebrew. There's probably a tiny bit of historical argument for that. But my argument simply is the linguistic one. It says, no, when you have these kind of changes taking on, it is the orality of the language use, not the fact that someone is sitting down to copy and sort of fake. It can happen that way, but really it's the orality, and we pick things up that are changing because of the context. So 3 quick takeaways, and then I'm finished in good time here. The invocation of the field of language, contact, and sociolinguistics in general keeps biblical studies firmly positioned within the realm of natural human language. For even under divine inspiration, human authors engage their ordinary conversational means and methods in whatever ways seem natural to them, whatever kinds of blends, borrowing, calques, or whatever else, they're doing it, if you will, naturally. Number 2, it should be noted that a major culprit behind contact-induced language interference is the competence in one's native language when producing a second language. And I'm going to give a local simple illustration that came out from my earlier research. I was talking to an Amish woman out in the Smicksburg area, and I told her I was studying these kinds of things for going to school. Their language is Pennsylvania German until they roughly go to 1st grade. And then they acquire English. And the Amish are fluent in English, let's be clear on that. But there's influence of the Pennsylvania German on their English. And I said, I'm running into some strange language constructions from the people I've been interviewing and some of the written stuff I've got. She goes, oh yes, she says, laughing, she says, some of those sentences are so strange that you hardly understand them, Ken. And she caught herself and left. She'd taken the Germanic word order for a dependent clause and through the verb, which reminds you of that quick bite by Mark Twain, who said he had a German novel, but he couldn't finish it because the last 2 pages had been lost and they contained all the verbs. Anyway, there we go. And then thirdly, it's readily apparent that native language influence upon New Testament Greek extends to various kinds of morphosyntactic, lexical, and semantic features of the New Testament, and this is just what you expect in a contact-rich environment. End of story. I'm happy for taking questions. I think I scared them.
Yeah, I am scared a little bit.
Okay.